in the bitter chill of 1944, as the thunder of Allied guns echoed through Europe, German tank crews believed themselves untouchable. Their Panthers ruled the battlefields, their armor deflecting shells that shattered against their steel hide. But then something changed. From the smoke and ruin came a sound unlike before, a sharper crack, a brighter flash, and a new terror screaming through the air. The Americans had unleashed a secret weapon, born from desperation and genius, the HVAP round. A tungsten-cored projectile so fast it could tear through Panther armor like paper. What followed was a brutal shift in the war's balance. A moment when the hunters became the hunted. Men who once mocked the Sherman as a tin can suddenly face death from the very tanks they dismissed. It wasn't just a weapon. It was psychological warfare, a steel-tipped answer to German superiority. This is the story of how innovation on the front lines rewrote battlefield dominance, how a single round changed the fate of countless men, and how arrogance met its match in a flash of fire and shattered armor. German overconfidence collapses before Allied ingenuity as the war in Europe entered its final, most brutal phase. By late 1944, the Wehrmacht's armored divisions still clung to an illusion of superiority. The Panther tank, with its sloped armor and high-velocity gun, was seen as the unmatched predator of the battlefield. German commanders believed that no Allied weapon could penetrate its frontal plate, a confidence that shaped their every maneuver. They advanced with arrogance, exposing their flanks and relying on sheer intimidation rather than adaptive tactics. Yet, behind Allied lines, a quiet revolution was taking place. American ordnance experts were dissecting captured German armor, measuring its weaknesses, studying the metallurgy, and designing a round that could defeat it. The result was not born from luck, but from scientific precision, a new ammunition type that would redefine engagement outcomes. When reports of the first successful HVAP impacts reached Allied headquarters, disbelief turned into grim satisfaction. Panther crews, once smug in their invincibility, began facing hits that tore through their steel like a hot knife through butter. Their shock was as much psychological as physical. For the first time since the Blitzkrieg years, German tankers found themselves reacting rather than commanding. Commanders who once scoffed at Sherman formations now ordered retreats when spotting them. The arrogance that once fueled the German armored corps became a fatal flaw. It blinded them to the rapid innovation unfolding. In the Allied war machine, German tactics still relied on frontal assaults and static defense positions, confident that armor thickness alone would secure victory. But the battlefield had evolved. American coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support meant that even the most advanced tank could not survive isolation. When the new 7.6 Panzer Shermans appeared, many German officers dismissed them as upgraded toys, until the first engagement shattered that notion. HVAP shells, traveling at unprecedented speeds, ripped through armor thought impenetrable. The resulting explosions ignited ammunition stores and sent flames through steel hulls. Survivors recounted hearing the terrifying metallic scream of a round that did not ricochet. It simply kept going, unstoppable. The Allied soldiers, long haunted by the sight of burning tanks and shredded comrades, found renewed morale. Confidence surged through the ranks, and American units that once avoided armored encounters began seeking them. The shift was not only technological, but psychological. The Germans, who had always relied on shock and awe, now faced it themselves. Their commanders tried to adapt, ordering dispersed formations and repositioned defences, but it was too late. The balance of fear had shifted. Every Panther that rolled into combat did so under the growing shadow of uncertainty. The myth of invincibility was gone. Reports from the front spoke of tank crews hesitating before advancing, scanning the terrain for unseen dangers. The Allies had finally cracked the code of German dominance. Not through numbers alone, but through intelligence, adaptation, and a refusal to surrender to despair. In the end, German overconfidence had paved the road to their own undoing. Their refusal to believe the enemy could match their technology cost them precious ground, countless machines, and irreplaceable men. Each engagement became a reminder that arrogance has no place in war, only evolution and strategy. The HVAP's arrival was not just a new weapon. It was a reckoning, one that turned German pride into ashes scattered across the smouldering fields of Europe. When the Allies realized brute force could not outmatch German armor, they turned toward intellect and science to shift the balance of power. The 76mm gun had proven reliable, but lacked the raw energy to pierce the thick frontal plates of the Panther and Tiger tanks. For months, engineers studied battle reports and the shattered remains of Allied shells that had bounced off enemy armor. It was clear that victory would require more than courage or numbers. It demanded innovation at the microscopic level. American scientists began experimenting with new metallurgical compositions, searching for a material dense enough to hold together at extreme velocities. The result was the high-velocity, armor-piercing round, a technological marvel encased in tungsten, a rare and valuable element capable of sustaining immense pressure. The round was not just an upgrade. It was a revolution. When fired, it accelerated faster than any shell the Sherman had ever discharged, reaching speeds that turned its impact into an almost surgical strike. Tests in secret ranges showed that the HVAP could slice through steel as though it were wood, leaving engineers stunned at its destructive power. Military tacticians immediately recognized what this meant for the battlefield. They reimagined engagement strategies, instructing Sherman crews to hold fire until targets came within optimal range, maximizing penetration and ensuring lethal precision. The tactic transformed tank combat from a gamble into a calculated science. German units, used to advancing without hesitation, now found themselves being hunted. Reports from the front lines began describing strange new hits that melted armor and ignited fuel compartments in an instant. The first time a Panther commander watched his machine torn open by a single 76mm shell, disbelief replaced arrogance. The myth of Allied inferiority vanished overnight. Yet, the brilliance of the HVAP round went beyond metallurgy. It was a triumph of coordination between scientists, soldiers, and strategists. Each piece of data collected from the front refined its performance. The Americans understood that the war could not be won by production alone. It had to be won by intelligence. Even the decision to limit HVAP distribution was deliberate. Commanders reserved it for specific divisions, tasked with breakthrough operations, ensuring that the weapon would appear unexpectedly and devastate the enemy, where morale was most fragile. German command soon became obsessed with understanding how their tanks were being destroyed so efficiently. Field reports were sent to Berlin, where engineers struggled to replicate the effect, but resource shortages and air raids crippled their efforts. Every HVAP strike was more than a kill. It was a psychological weapon. Panther crews began doubting their armor, scanning the horizon for threats that could not be anticipated. Their confidence, once unshakable, dissolved under the weight of uncertainty. American crews, in contrast, grew bolder, maneuvering with renewed purpose, trusting their weapons as extensions of their own survival. The introduction of the HVAP did not just enhance firepower, it redefined strategy. Allied forces started prioritizing precision engagements over brute exchanges, forcing the Germans into defensive postures that drained their fuel and coordination. Intelligence officers tracked enemy communication, noting a sharp decline in aggression as Panther divisions avoided confrontation in fear of the unknown shell. The psychological tide had shifted entirely. On paper, the HVAP was a single piece of ammunition, but in practice, it was the embodiment of Allied evolution, proof that adaptability could overpower even the most sophisticated armor. The Germans, trapped in their rigid doctrines, never truly grasped that warfare had changed. Every destroyed Panther served as both a physical and symbolic defeat, marking the slow death of the German war machine's supremacy. What had begun as a scientific experiment had become one of the most decisive elements in reshaping the very nature of armored warfare in World War II. The introduction of the 76mm HVAP round did more than give Allied tank crews new firepower. It redefined the psychological and tactical landscape of armored warfare. When American engineers perfected this tungsten-core ammunition, commanders wasted no time deploying it in critical operations where German armor had previously held dominance. The first real test came in the shattered landscapes of France, where columns of Panthers guarded crossroads and villages with seemingly invincible confidence. Sherman crews, who once approached such encounters with dread, now advanced with sharpened precision. Every round fired was part of a calculated dance of range, speed, and angle. Tank commanders learned to exploit terrain using ridgelines and smoke screens to conceal movements until the exact moment they could unleash the HVAP shell. What followed was often a single, thunderous blast that cracked through armor, as though it were glass, followed by the roar of ignited fuel. For the first time, German crews saw their prized machines burn under the assault of an Allied gun they had mocked as inferior. The shock of that realization spread faster than any shell. Radio chatter between German units carried a tone of disbelief, their veterans asking how a Sherman could possibly destroy a Panther head on. The truth was that Allied intelligence had not only developed a better round, but also crafted doctrines around it that emphasized teamwork, timing, and precision. No longer did Sherman tanks rush blindly into battles. They coordinated in hunter-killer teams using flanking maneuvers supported by reconnaissance aircraft. Once the target's position was fixed, one tank would draw attention, while the others slipped into position to deliver the lethal HVAP strike. This coordination mirrored infantry tactics, more than traditional armoured clashes, and caught the German command off guard. They had underestimated the Allies' capacity for adaptation. The results were immediate and devastating. Panthers, which had previously dominated open fields, became vulnerable in every encounter. Some German divisions tried reinforcing their armour with makeshift plating, but this only slowed them down, making them easier targets. Others attempted to change tactics, ordering ambushes instead of advances. Yet even that failed because American crews learned to read the battlefield more effectively, anticipating positions and using cover to their advantage. The HVAP's power gave them confidence, but it was the discipline of its use that turned it into a war-winning tool. Every engagement became a demonstration of balance between patience and aggression. Commanders instructed their men to wait for that perfect shot, one decisive strike rather than wasteful barrages. The battlefield began to echo with fewer, deadlier blasts, each followed by the sight of smoking German wrecks. Even intelligence officers noticed the shift in tone among enemy reports. The Wehrmacht's once proud tank corps began referring to Sherman units as hunters, a title that reflected the inversion of roles. The hunters had become the hunted. Behind this transformation was not just superior weaponry, but a deep understanding of psychological warfare. American strategists knew that breaking enemy confidence was as vital as breaking their tanks. They timed HVAP deployments to coincide with major offensives, ensuring that news of its effectiveness would travel through German ranks before the next confrontation. Fear became a weapon, just as effective as tungsten. German tank commanders, once eager for battle, began hesitating before engagements, second, guessing their armour, their range, even their training. That hesitation was fatal. Allied units exploited it relentlessly, pushing forward with a ferocity that felt unstoppable. By late 1944, reports from the front painted a clear picture. Wherever the 76 MU HVAP appeared, German resistance crumbled faster. The myth of the invincible Panther was shattered not by numbers, but by ingenuity. The Americans had proven that the true battlefield victory belonged to those who learned, adapted, and struck when their enemy least expected. Each destroyed tank told the same story, a story of science meeting strategy, and of how a single innovation could tilt the balance of an entire war. As the war reached its brutal crescendo in late 1944, the arrival of HVAP ammunition turned the Allied armoured forces into a thinking, coordinated machine that could outfight even the most advanced German panzers. The transformation was not simply mechanical, but deeply tactical, born from a clear recognition of how German commanders fought. The Wehrmacht had long relied on the Panthers' psychological edge, believing that fear and reputation could do half the work. Before the first shell was fired, American strategists knew this, and they built their countermeasures not just around the gun's new strength, but around deception and coordination. Sherman units began to operate in tight platoons, supported by artillery and aircraft. Reconnaissance units marked the terrain, pinpointing where the Panthers hid in hedgerows or behind stone walls. When the first shot was fired, it wasn't random, it was precise, measured, and devastating. The HVAP rounds punched through armour that had once been untouchable, cutting through the battlefield myths that had defined German superiority. German commanders were forced to change their entire engagement doctrine. Instead of the bold thrusts that had characterized their blitzkrieg, they now fought defensively, moving their armor under cover of darkness, hiding behind smoke screens, and retreating whenever air reconnaissance appeared overhead. Yet these changes only delayed the inevitable. The Allies had learned to synchronize every arm of their forces into a single destructive rhythm. Air support would soften positions, artillery would bracket targets, and Shermans, armed with HVAP rounds, would move in for the kill. The precision of these maneuvers was astonishing. It reflected a war machine that had evolved from improvisation to exact science. The Germans, accustomed to dictating the pace of battle, now found themselves reacting to an enemy who had mastered adaptability. Even terrain, once considered advantageous, became a liability. Forests, villages, and open plains all became traps as Allied forces used superior communication networks to outmaneuver every German move. Radio coordination allowed tanks and infantry to operate like parts of a single organism. When one unit encountered resistance, another would flank, and the HVAP Shermans would strike from unexpected angles. German crews who survived these encounters described the feeling as fighting ghosts. Silent movements, sudden explosions, and the shocking realization that their armor was no longer protection, but a coffin of steel. The tactical brilliance behind these operations came from an understanding that technology alone does not win wars. It is the marriage of intellect and timing that breaks the enemy's will. The Americans had studied not just how to destroy German tanks, but how to destroy German confidence. Every Panther wreck was photographed and broadcast through Allied intelligence channels as propaganda, serving as proof that the tide had permanently turned. German morale began to collapse, especially among armoured divisions that had once been considered elite. The 2nd Panzer Division, once a spearhead of terror, now moved cautiously, aware that its once vaunted reputation no longer protected it. Even the legendary Tiger battalions felt the pressure, their thick armour offering no reassurance against the sharp velocity of the new ammunition. The Allies knew they had achieved something far greater than technical superiority. They had rewritten the rules of armoured warfare. Each engagement demonstrated the same principle. Flexibility beats rigidity, coordination beats arrogance, and innovation beats tradition. The Germans had perfected the art of war, as it was, but the Allies were mastering what it was becoming. In that transformation lay the heart of victory. The introduction of HVAP ammunition symbolized this shift more than any other weapon. For it was not merely an advancement in firepower, but a declaration that the age of the unstoppable tank was over. What replaced it was the age of calculated precision, where battles were won through strategy, speed, and scientific mastery. In those final months, as German steel burned on European fields, the message became clear to every soldier on both sides. The war's outcome was no longer decided by who had the biggest guns, but by who understood how to use them with intelligence and unity. By the time winter crept over the shattered landscapes of Europe, the psychological and tactical transformation brought by the HVAP equipped Shermans had reached its zenith. The Allies had learned to exploit not only the raw power of the new ammunition, but also the weaknesses in the German command structure that had once seemed flawless. The German army, stretched thin across multiple fronts, struggled to maintain its once precise coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery. American tacticians seized upon this fracture, devising strike operations that aimed to isolate and dismantle armored divisions before they could regroup. The 76 mm HVAP shells became the spearhead of these operations, their unmatched velocity giving Allied crews the confidence to engage targets at ranges previously unthinkable. On frozen battlefields, where movement was restricted and visibility often poor, the ability to fire first, and with devastating accuracy, became the decisive advantage. American units began perfecting shoot and shift tactics, engaging from concealed positions, landing a single fatal hit, and then relocating before German counterfire could arrive. This blend of precision and mobility transformed Allied tank warfare into an art of controlled aggression. It was not brute force that won these duels, but the subtle mastery of timing and terrain. The HVAP's effectiveness allowed commanders to shift from defensive reactions to deliberate offensives. The Allied strategy became one of exhaustion, forcing the Germans to fight on multiple fronts, draining their fuel, their supplies, and, most importantly, their will. Every tank destroyed was not merely a mechanical loss, but a psychological wound. German crews began doubting their machines, questioning every order that sent them toward an unseen enemy. Hitler's high command refused to accept that Allied weaponry could equal their engineering, insisting that failures were due to poor tactics or cowardice. But the reality was clear on the ground. The precision of American gunnery, combined with superior logistics and relentless aerial reconnaissance, made every confrontation an uphill struggle for the once dominant Panthers. The Germans tried desperately to adapt by creating new armor configurations and camouflage techniques, yet none could counter the fundamental truth that they were being out-thought as much as out-fought. Allied command centers meticulously analyzed each engagement, refining firing ranges, angles of attack, and coordination patterns. It became a war of mathematics as much as courage. While German doctrine clung to outdated notions of direct confrontation, the Americans emphasized fluid motion and adaptability. Each successful ambush, each Panther turned to scrap, reinforced this evolution. The Germans, meanwhile, suffered from the rigidity of their own hierarchy. Orders from Berlin often arrived late or contradicted field reports, leading to confusion and frontal hesitation. On the front lines, the results were catastrophic. Entire tank companies that once rolled into battle with confidence now crept forward like hunted beasts. The sound of a distant Sherman gun was enough to send veterans scanning desperately for cover. What made this transformation even more devastating was how invisible it often seemed. There was no grand Allied offensive at first, no massive breakthrough, just a relentless accumulation of small, perfect victories. One Panther at a time, one skirmish after another. The myth of German invulnerability evaporated. As the weeks turned into months, German soldiers began abandoning disabled vehicles, knowing there was no time or safety to repair them. The once feared sight of a German armoured column became rarer, replaced by scattered remnants trying to survive. The HVAP-equipped Shermans had become more than machines. They were symbols of evolution itself, living proof that strategy could overturn even the most entrenched technological superiority. Every engagement served as a lesson, every explosion a page in the rewriting of modern warfare. By the time the snow melted, the German armoured divisions that had once thundered across Europe were shadows of their former might. The Allies had achieved what once seemed impossible, not merely defeating an enemy, but dismantling the mythology that had sustained them. In that achievement lay one of history's greatest reversals, where intelligence and precision triumphed over arrogance and stagnation, proving that no empire of steel can endure when its opponents learn faster than it can adapt. The true genius of the Allied advance during the final stages of the war lay not merely in the tools they forged, but in the way they wielded them, turning battlefield chaos into coordinated precision. By the time the 76 mm HVAP round had proven its power, American commanders understood that victory would come not from brute attrition, but from mastery of tempo and terrain. They began using tank formations less like independent units and more like moving components of an orchestrated machine, each supported by artillery, infantry, and air reconnaissance. The key was synchronization, an understanding that every second of combat had to serve a broader purpose. When a Sherman fired its HVAP shell, it wasn't just destroying an enemy tank, it was signaling the next move in a fluid, interlocking pattern of maneuvers. This elevated warfare to an almost mathematical discipline, one that Germany's once vaunted armoured doctrine could no longer counter. The Germans were accustomed to decisive engagements and shock tactics, but the Americans had transformed battle into a continuous rhythm of pressure and adaptation. Air units fed live reconnaissance to advancing columns, guiding them around ambush zones and pointing out the weakest points in German lines. Artillery batteries coordinated with armoured divisions to deliver timed barrages that herded enemy tanks into open fields. Perfect killing zones for the Shermans, lying in wait. The HVAP's incredible velocity allowed the Allied gunners to engage from distances where German optics began to lose effectiveness. German tankers were forced to fire hurriedly, often missing their mark, while Allied shells struck with clinical precision. What had once been a contest of strength now resembled a predator-prey dynamic in which every German movement was tracked, anticipated, and punished. Allied tactics began to rely heavily on deception. Dummy tanks, staged smoke screens, and feigned retreats became common tools to draw German armour into exposed positions. Once the trap was set, HVAP armed Shermans would emerge from concealed flanks, firing with devastating accuracy. These ambushes shattered the last vestiges of German confidence. What had started as an effort to counter superior tanks evolved into a doctrine of total battlefield dominance, built on the fusion of intelligence, logistics, and tactical innovation. The Americans proved that adaptability was the most lethal weapon of all. Their command structure, less rigid than the German hierarchy, allowed field officers to make decisions on the spot, reacting to fluid conditions with autonomy. This flexibility created an environment where initiative thrived, and small victories snowballed into massive breakthroughs. The Germans, bound by the strict control of high command, could not respond with similar agility. Orders filtered slowly down the chain, often arriving too late to matter. In one engagement after another, Panther and Tiger battalions found themselves outmaneuvered, their massive guns rendered irrelevant by superior Allied positioning. Even the terrain, once an ally to German defences, turned against them. River crossings, hill passes, and urban centres all became traps where coordination between Allied ground and air units overwhelmed every attempt at resistance. The sound of incoming artillery blended with the screech of tank treads and the thunder of HVAP shells slicing through armour. Each explosion echoed the same truth. The Germans were no longer dictating the war's terms. Intelligence units recorded the changing tone in intercepted German communications. Frantic, uncertain, and increasingly resigned, what once had been confident radio chatter was now filled with reports of unseen fire and phantom tanks. The psychological effect of fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate every move was devastating. German tank crews, trained to believe in their invulnerability, were now retreating before engagements even began. The Allies, understanding this fear, exploited it ruthlessly. They pushed deeper into occupied territory, maintaining unrelenting momentum that left the enemy no time to regroup. Each victory was followed not by pause, but by pursuit. This relentless pace broke the myth of German discipline and endurance. The lesson that emerged from these operations became timeless: the greatest weapon in war is not the machine, but the mind behind it. The Allies had evolved beyond reaction. They had learned to shape the battlefield itself. Through meticulous coordination, unshakable focus, and the unforgiving precision of the HVAP, they proved that even the mightiest war machine could be undone by an opponent that learned, adapted, and struck with purpose. In the end, what destroyed the German armour wasn't just superior ammunition. It was superior intellect wielded with unyielding will. When the final months of the war descended upon Europe, the story of the HVAP round and the 7-6 WMs, Sherman had become more than a tale of technological triumph. It was a testament to the power of evolution under fire. By that stage, the Allied command had transformed battlefield methodology into something resembling an art form, weaving precision, deception, and timing into a single, seamless doctrine that left German divisions in disarray. What made this evolution truly historic was not just the weapon itself, but the way it reshaped strategic thought. Allied generals had realized that overwhelming force meant little without coordination and foresight. Every HVAP shell fired represented not a random act of destruction, but a deliberate stroke in a calculated symphony of warfare. The Americans, once criticized for being tactically predictable, had become the most adaptive army on the continent. German field officers found themselves facing an opponent who could not be anticipated, whose responses seemed to shift with every encounter. Intelligence networks ensured that no German movement went unseen. Reconnaissance planes mapped enemy armor columns in real time, while ground units used coded transmissions to synchronize artillery and tank movements with surgical accuracy. The result was a kind of warfare that Germany had never prepared for, a war of constant adaptation. The Panthers and Tigers, designed for dominance in head-to-head combat, were now fighting an enemy that refused to fight by their rules. The HVAP ammunition made it possible for lighter tanks to strike from unexpected distances. But the real brilliance lay in how the Americans chose when and where to strike. They targeted supply routes, communication hubs, and bridge crossings, cutting off the arteries that fed the German war machine. Instead of pursuing glory in grand clashes, they choked the enemy's ability to move, think, or respond. This shift from brute confrontation to systemic dismantling signaled a complete inversion of German doctrine. Hitler's command, still obsessed with grand offensives and symbolic defenses, failed to grasp that the Allies had already transcended that kind of warfare. Where the Germans saw the battlefield as a contest of machines, the Allies saw it as a living network, one that could be manipulated, disrupted, and reshaped. The HVAP round was the blade that cut through this web with mathematical precision. Each engagement became a study in control. Tank platoons would advance silently under the cover of darkness, waiting for the signal that enemy armor was exposed. Then, with uncanny timing, coordinated strikes would erupt across multiple fronts, leaving German crews disoriented and unable to determine the source of their destruction. The illusion of invincibility that had defined the German panzer divisions evaporated entirely. Fear spread through their ranks, not because of sheer numbers, but because of unpredictability. The Allies had mastered the rhythm of uncertainty, ensuring that no German tank commander could ever feel safe, no matter how thick his armor or how experienced his crew. This psychological collapse was perhaps the greatest Allied victory of all. Even the most hardened veterans began to question their training, their leadership, and their very machines. The Germans tried to counter with heavier armor and desperate ambushes, but by then the initiative had slipped beyond their reach. American forces were no longer reacting. They were dictating. Every encounter unfolded according to their plan. Every response from the enemy anticipated before it even began. The battlefield had become a chessboard, and the Allies were thinking 3 moves ahead. As towns fell and defenses crumbled, the sheer sophistication of Allied command became undeniable. Military historians would later call it a revolution in applied warfare, where knowledge, communication, and precision replaced brute force as the deciding factors. The 76 Beimensemieth HVAP was not just a weapon. It was the physical embodiment of that shift, a symbol of how intellect could outmatch power. When German survivors finally abandoned their vehicles and retreated through the smoking wreckage of their own making, it became clear that the old ways of war had died with them. The Allies had redefined victory not through destruction alone, but through control, foresight, and the relentless pursuit of innovation. In the cold ashes of Europe's battlefields, one truth emerged beyond all others. Wars are not won by those who cling to strength, but by those who evolve faster than their enemies can comprehend.